When the Grumman F4F Wildcat first entered combat in the Pacific War, Japanese pilots were initially curious rather than intimidated. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been flying the agile Mitsubishi A6M0, which dominated the skies early in the war. Against such a lightweight, long-range fighter, the Wildcat appeared heavy and underpowered at first glance. Japanese reports from 1941 and early 1942 described it as slower and less maneuverable than the Zero, but with surprisingly strong durability. In the opening clashes over Wake Island and the Coral Sea, Japanese aviators noted that the Wildcat could absorb a level of damage that would have sent most aircraft spiraling down. This ruggedness led to an immediate shift in tactics. While they still tried to outmaneuver the Wildcat, they became aware that simply scoring a few hits would not guarantee a kill. Japanese intelligence quickly realized that the Wildcat's biggest strength was not speed or agility, but the ability to take punishment and keep flying. This resilience forced Japanese pilots to focus on precise shooting, often aiming for the cockpit or engine to ensure a downing. Although they still considered the Zero the superior dogfighter, they began to see the Wildcat as a stubborn and dangerous opponent, one that required respect in any engagement. The early war impression among Japanese fighter pilots was clear. The Wildcat might not win on agility, but it was far from an easy kill. In December 1941, the Battle of Wake Island marked the first significant encounter between the F4F Wildcat and Japanese carrier-based aircraft. The Japanese expected an easy victory, believing their Zero fighters and bombers would overwhelm the small American garrison. However, the Wildcat stationed there managed to shoot down multiple enemy planes, despite being heavily outnumbered. Japanese after-action reports expressed surprise at how well the Wildcat could still fight even after sustaining hits. One pilot noted that, "The American fighter does not fall when riddled," a statement that reflected the frustration of facing an aircraft with thick armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, features absent on the lighter Zero. The Wildcat's defensive tactics, such as diving away and using hit and run passes, also baffled Japanese pilots who were accustomed to prolonged turning battles. The Japanese began to understand that engaging Wildcats on their own terms was risky. Instead of entering tight turning duels, they focused on boom and zoom attacks, striking from above and using their superior climb rate to regain altitude. This shift in tactics was a direct result of their respect for the Wildcat's resilience. Wake Island proved that even when outnumbered, the Wildcat could be a formidable opponent, a lesson Japan carried into future battles. Japanese fighter doctrine in 1941 and 1942 was built on the Zero's unmatched maneuverability. The A6M could out-turn virtually any Allied aircraft, and Japanese pilots had been trained to exploit this in dogfights. When facing the F4F Wildcat, however, this advantage was not enough to guarantee victory. The Wildcat's structure allowed it to dive faster and survive more punishment than the fragile Zero. Japanese pilots soon realized that head-on attacks against a Wildcat were dangerous, as its .50 caliber Browning machine guns could shred an aircraft in seconds. In post-combat debriefs, some Japanese aviators commented that the Wildcat's firepower felt overwhelming compared to the lighter armed Zero. While the Zero remained the better dogfighter in a pure turning contest, the Wildcat's ability to absorb damage meant that Japanese pilots often needed 2 or 3 separate firing passes to secure a kill. This was time-consuming and risky, especially when Wildcats flew in disciplined formations that covered each other. Japanese airmen began respecting the Wildcat not as an equal in agility, but as a predator that could not be taken lightly, especially in a head-to-head exchange. This forced Japanese tactics to evolve, prioritizing speed and positioning over drawn-out turning engagements. By the time of the Coral Sea and Midway battles in 1942, Japanese fighter leaders had adjusted their approach to dealing with Wildcats. They emphasized the importance of altitude advantage, energy retention, and coordinated strikes rather than solo dogfights. Japanese intelligence briefings specifically warned pilots against underestimating the Wildcat's defensive capabilities. They recommended attacking from the rear quarter or diving from above to exploit the Wildcat's slower climb rate. This slash-and-run tactic mirrored the boom and zoom strategy used by American pilots against the Zero, showing how both sides adapted to each other's strengths and weaknesses. Japanese records indicate that while they still preferred engaging Wildcats over faster fighters like the P-38 Lightning, they no longer considered them easy prey. The respect for the Wildcat grew further after Midway, where its combination of toughness, teamwork, and firepower contributed to heavy Japanese aircraft losses. The shift in Japanese thinking was clear. The Wildcat might be slower, but in the hands of skilled pilots, it could not be underestimated. One of the most striking impressions Japanese pilots had of the F4F Wildcat was its almost stubborn refusal to go down. In several engagements, Wildcats returned to their carriers or island bases riddled with bullet holes, missing control surfaces, or with engines barely running. To Japanese aviators, who were used to the lightweight but fragile Zero, this was baffling. They began to view the Wildcat's durability as a psychological weapon, one that demoralized attackers who expected quick kills. Japanese combat diaries occasionally expressed frustration, noting that the enemy's machine lives longer than expected. This durability often gave Wildcat pilots the confidence to press attacks that might have intimidated other pilots. Moreover, American pilots used the aircraft's ruggedness to their advantage, willingly trading hits with Zeros in situations where survival odds were still in their favor. The Japanese came to realize that fighting a Wildcat was not just a contest of maneuverability, but also of endurance, and that the Americans were often willing to take more risks because they trusted their machines to bring them home. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 became a defining moment in Japanese perceptions of the Wildcat. During this battle, Wildcats played a key role in defending American carriers from wave after wave of Japanese air attacks. While many Wildcats were lost, they managed to inflict significant damage on attacking bombers and fighters. Japanese pilots were shocked at how aggressively the Wildcats defended their carriers, often throwing themselves directly into the path of incoming raids. Despite heavy losses, the Wildcats' fierce resistance contributed to the overall American victory. Post-battle analysis by Japanese naval staff acknowledged that the Wildcat was stout and reliable, and that its pilots were brave and disciplined. While the Zero still outperformed it in certain aspects, the Wildcat had earned a reputation as a formidable fighter, one that could not be casually dismissed. During the long and brutal Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese aviators came to know the Wildcat as a constant, frustrating opponent. Operating from Henderson Field, U.S., Marine Corps Wildcats defended the island against repeated Japanese bombing and fighter sweeps. The tropical climate, rough airstrips, and constant combat made conditions harsh, yet the Wildcat continued to perform. Japanese pilots noted that the Wildcat's ability to withstand damage gave them a significant edge in survival rates. Even when a Wildcat was hit, it often managed to limp back to base, be repaired, and return to the fight within days. Over time, Japanese pilots began to see the Wildcat as a symbol of American persistence. Always there, always ready to fight again. The Guadalcanal experience cemented the Wildcat's reputation among Japanese forces as a fighter that, while not unbeatable, was exceptionally hard to destroy. By late 1943, the Wildcat was gradually being replaced by the faster and more powerful F4F Hellcat, but it still served in secondary roles and on escort carriers. Japanese pilots who had faced both types of aircraft often reflected on how the Wildcat had been the more frustrating opponent in some ways. Not because it was superior in performance, but because it had forced them to change their tactics and respect their enemy's resilience. The Wildcat had been the first American fighter to challenge the Zero on relatively even terms in the early war period. Even though newer aircraft would surpass it, the memory of those early battles lingered. Japanese accounts described the Wildcat as the Iron Airplane, a nickname that summed up its lasting impression. Looking back after the war, Japanese veterans often spoke of the F4F Wildcat with a mixture of respect and frustration. It was not the fastest, nor the most maneuverable aircraft they faced, but it had qualities that made it a dangerous foe: toughness, heavy firepower, disciplined pilots, and clever tactics. For many Japanese aviators, the Wildcat symbolized the moment when American air power began to adapt and push back against Japanese dominance in the Pacific. In interviews decades later, some Japanese pilots admitted that they underestimated the Wildcat at first, only to learn the hard way that it was a fighter built to win wars, not just dogfights. In their eyes, the Wildcat earned its place in aviation history not because of raw performance, but because it forced Japan to respect an opponent they once believed they could easily defeat. Japanese reports on Wildcat encounters also highlighted the Americans' disciplined use of teamwork. Unlike some Allied air forces early in the war, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Wildcat pilots often flew in pairs or sections, covering each other's blind spots. This made it extremely difficult for a Japanese pilot to surprise or ambush a Wildcat. The famous Thach Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thach, became a particular source of annoyance for Japanese pilots. This defensive maneuver allowed two Wildcats to protect each other from a more maneuverable opponent by weaving back and forth, bringing guns to bear on any attacker. Japanese accounts admitted that this tactic was effective in breaking the Zero's advantage in one-on-one turning fights. The respect for the Wildcat grew not only from its physical strengths, but also from the disciplined and coordinated way it was flown. This contrasted sharply with the often individualistic style of Japanese fighter pilots, making the Wildcat a difficult adversary even when outnumbered.